My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because tonight's story begins with a single phone call that neither person expected. This is a fictional story about love, courage, second chances, and the life-changing power of honest communication. Sometimes, the biggest moments in our lives don't begin with loud celebrations or dramatic music. They begin with silence, followed by a message that changes everything. Somewhere tonight, someone is staring at their phone, reading your name over and over again, wondering if they are finally brave enough to press the call button. Their heart is racing, their hands are trembling, and for the first time in a very long time, they know they can't stay silent any longer. For weeks, they had carried something inside that refused to let them rest. Every morning they promised themselves they would tell you. Every evening they convinced themselves to wait one more day. Fear became their constant companion. They worried about saying the wrong thing. They worried about arriving too late. Most of all, they worried that one conversation might change the future forever. Yet the truth kept growing louder until ignoring it became impossible. Tonight, something happened that made them realize there was no more time to hide behind uncertainty. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Earlier that afternoon, while cleaning out an old storage room in their family home, they discovered a worn cardboard box hidden beneath years of forgotten belongings. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten letters, old train tickets, birthday cards, and journals that had not been opened in years. As they carefully turned each page, forgotten memories came rushing back. They remembered who they had been before fear, disappointment, and heartbreak slowly convinced them to stop believing in love. Reading those pages felt like meeting an older version of themselves who still dreamed without hesitation. They suddenly realized how much of that hopeful person had disappeared over the years. Then something unexpected happened. Folded between 2 pages of an old journal was a letter they had written to themselves many years earlier. The handwriting was younger, but the words felt strangely timeless. It simply read, "If you ever find someone who makes you feel safe enough to tell the truth, don't lose them because of fear." They stared at that sentence for several minutes without moving. It felt less like reading an old note and more like receiving advice from a younger version of themselves who had somehow understood exactly what they would one day need to hear. Stay until the very end, because the story was only beginning. That evening they went for a long walk through the quiet streets of their neighborhood, hoping fresh air would calm the storm inside their heart. Instead, every step only made one realization clearer. They weren't afraid because they lacked feelings. They were afraid because those feelings had become impossible to ignore. Every memory you had shared together suddenly carried new meaning. Every conversation replayed inside their mind. Every smile, every laugh, every quiet moment reminded them that life had quietly placed someone extraordinary in their path, and they had almost allowed fear to convince them to walk away from it. Something huge was waiting in this story. Standing beneath a streetlight as gentle rain began falling, they finally removed their phone from their pocket. Your name appeared on the screen exactly where it had so many times before. Their thumb hovered over the call button, but hesitation returned once again. "What if I'm too late?" they whispered to themselves. "What if everything has already changed?" The questions felt endless. Yet deep within their heart another voice quietly answered, "You'll never know unless you finally speak." They took one deep breath and pressed the button. The phone rang once. Then twice. Then 3 times. Every second felt like an hour. Their heartbeat echoed louder than the rain falling around them. They almost ended the call before anyone answered. Then suddenly, "Hello?" The sound of your voice stopped the entire world around them. For several moments they couldn't speak. Every sentence they had rehearsed disappeared completely. All that remained was overwhelming emotion. You immediately noticed something unusual. They never called this late at night. They never sounded this nervous. Before you could ask another question, they quietly whispered, "I need to talk to you. Something happened today, and I don't think I can keep this inside any longer." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence before a door finally opens after being locked for years. You listened carefully as they struggled to find the right words. They explained discovering the old journal, the forgotten letter, and the realization that fear had been making too many decisions for far too long. "Nothing dramatic happened today," they admitted softly. "The biggest thing that happened inside me. I realized I've been letting fear speak louder than my heart, and I don't want to live that way anymore. Listen carefully, because this changes everything." You remained quiet for a moment before gently asking, "So why did you call me?" They smiled through tears no one could see over the phone. "Because every time I imagined becoming the person I always wanted to be, you were somehow part of that picture. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just another ordinary friendship. I needed you to know the truth, not because I expect anything from you, but because some feelings become too important to hide." Outside, the rain slowly came to an end. The clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky filled with countless stars. Standing alone beneath that peaceful night, they realized that regardless of how the conversation ended, they had already crossed the hardest bridge. They had chosen honesty over fear. They had chosen courage over silence. They had finally allowed their heart to speak after years of whispering in the shadows. But what you said next would become the moment that changed both of your lives forever. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because the words spoken over that late-night phone call refuse to leave either of your hearts. After hearing them quietly admit, "I needed you to know the truth," everything seemed to stand still. The world outside continued moving, cars passed beneath glowing streetlights, the rain slowly faded into silence, and the stars began appearing between the clouds. Yet for both of you, time itself felt frozen. Neither of you realized that one honest conversation was about to become the beginning of a chapter neither of you had imagined possible. Sometimes the biggest moments in life don't arrive with dramatic music or impossible miracles. Sometimes they begin with two people finally choosing honesty over fear. You remained silent for several long moments, allowing every word they had spoken to settle inside your heart. They immediately became nervous. The silence felt endless. Their imagination began creating worst-case scenarios all over again. Perhaps they had said too much. Perhaps they had waited too long. Perhaps this phone call had only confirmed every fear they had carried for months. They almost apologized for calling so late. They almost ended the conversation before hearing your response. But something inside them quietly whispered that courage means staying present even when the outcome remains uncertain. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. You finally spoke, your voice calm and gentle. I've always felt there was something you were trying to tell me. I just didn't know what it was. Those simple words immediately brought tears to their eyes. They hadn't realized how visible their inner struggle had become. All those months of pretending everything was fine had never truly hidden what their heart was carrying. You continued softly, I'm not surprised that you're afraid. I'm grateful you trusted me enough to stop hiding. At that moment, they realized the conversation was no longer about fear. It had become about trust. The following morning neither of you could stop thinking about what had happened. They replayed every sentence in their mind while walking through the quiet streets near their apartment. For the first time in years, they noticed details they had overlooked before. The warmth of the morning sunlight, children laughing on their way to school, neighbors greeting each other with genuine smiles, birds singing from the trees. It wasn't that the world had suddenly changed. It was that the weight inside their heart had finally become lighter. Secrets had a way of making everything feel heavy. Honesty had quietly given them room to breathe again. Something huge was waiting in this story. That afternoon you suggested meeting in person rather than continuing through messages. You chose a quiet botanical garden where colorful flowers stretched across winding paths beneath towering trees. It felt peaceful, almost as though nature itself encouraged slow conversations instead of rushed conclusions. As they saw you walking toward them, their heartbeat quickened once again. Yet this time the fear felt different. It wasn't the fear of losing everything. It was the nervous excitement of someone stepping into a future that finally felt real. You walked together without speaking at first. The gentle sound of flowing water from a nearby fountain filled the silence. Eventually you stopped beside a small wooden bridge overlooking a pond where sunlight shimmered across the surface. Looking at them, you quietly asked, "What made last night different? Why now?" They smiled sadly before answering, "Because I finally realized that hiding my heart was hurting both of us. I kept waiting for the perfect moment, but perfect moments don't exist. There are only honest ones." Those words lingered between you like the gentle breeze moving through the garden. You could see the sincerity in their eyes. There was no performance left, no carefully rehearsed version of themselves. They were simply standing before you exactly as they were, hopeful, nervous, imperfect, and completely honest. They admitted they didn't know what the future would bring. They couldn't promise there would never be difficult days. They couldn't promise they would always have the right words. But they could promise one thing they had never fully offered before. From this day forward, they would never allow fear to speak louder than truth again. Stay until the very end, because the most emotional moment had not yet arrived. As the afternoon sun slowly dipped lower across the sky, you reached into your pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. It was a note you had written after the phone call the night before. Handing it to them, you quietly smiled and said, "I wasn't sure whether I would read this aloud, so I wrote it instead." With slightly trembling hands, they opened the note. The first sentence simply read, "The courage it took for you to call me means more than you'll ever know." They paused, already fighting back tears. The second sentence read, "I don't expect perfection. I only ask for honesty." By the time they reached the final line, they could barely see through the tears gathering in their eyes. "I don't know exactly where this journey will lead us. But I'd rather walk an honest road with you than a perfect illusion with anyone else." For several long moments, neither of you spoke. Words were no longer necessary. The walls that had separated two hearts for so long had quietly disappeared, replaced by something much stronger than certainty, mutual trust, genuine vulnerability, and the willingness to keep choosing one another, one truthful conversation at a time. As the evening light bathed the garden in warm shades of gold, both of you smiled, knowing that the biggest thing that had happened wasn't hidden inside a dramatic event at all. It was the quiet decision to stop letting fear write the story and finally allow love, honesty, and hope to write the next chapter instead. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because after that unforgettable afternoon in the garden, neither of your lives would ever feel quite the same again. The conversation had ended, but the emotions it awakened refused to fade. As you both walked toward the parking lot beneath the soft glow of the setting sun, there was a peaceful silence between you. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence that comes after two hearts finally stop hiding. For the first time, neither of you felt the pressure to pretend. Every wall that had once separated your hearts had quietly fallen away, leaving only honesty standing where fear had lived for so long. That evening, they returned home and placed their phone on the kitchen table without looking at it. For months, every notification had filled them with anxiety. Every missed call had made them wonder if they had already lost their chance. But tonight felt different. Instead of worrying about tomorrow, they stood by the window watching the stars slowly appear across the darkening sky. They smiled softly as they remembered your words from the garden. "I'd rather walk an honest road with you than a perfect illusion with anyone else." Those words echoed through every corner of their heart. They realized they had spent years trying to become worthy of love when perhaps the real journey had always been learning to receive it with humility. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Early the next morning, while organizing a shelf filled with old keepsakes, they found a small envelope they had completely forgotten. It contained several photographs from years before, along with a folded piece of paper written in their own handwriting. Curious, they opened it. The note had been written during one of the most difficult seasons of their life. It read, "If I ever find someone who loves the real me instead of the version I pretend to be, I'll never waste that gift." Reading those words brought tears to their eyes. Without realizing it, the promise they had made to themselves years earlier was finally beginning to come true. Meanwhile, you couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. You replayed every conversation, every quiet smile, every honest confession. Instead of focusing on who they had once been, your thoughts kept returning to who they consistently chose to be now. You remembered the way they treated strangers with kindness, the patience they showed during difficult moments, the way they accepted responsibility without blaming others, and the courage it had taken to reveal their fears without demanding immediate forgiveness. You understood something important. Character is not built in a single dramatic moment. It is revealed through ordinary choices repeated every day. Something huge was waiting in this story. A few days later, you invited them to join you for a weekend trip to a quiet coastal town known for its peaceful beaches and breathtaking sunrise views. Neither of you wanted extravagant adventures. You simply wanted uninterrupted time together away from the noise of everyday life. As you arrived, the sound of waves crashing gently against the shore created a sense of calm that neither of you had felt in a long time. Walking barefoot along the sand, you shared stories from childhood, laughed about awkward memories, and discovered dreams neither of you had ever spoken aloud before. Every conversation brought another layer of understanding, proving that the strongest relationships grow through curiosity, honesty, and time. As evening settled over the ocean, you climbed a small hill overlooking the endless water. The horizon glowed with brilliant shades of orange, pink, and deep violet as the sun slowly disappeared into the distance. Standing there together, they quietly admitted something they had never told anyone. For years I believed my past would always be the loudest part of my story. I thought no matter how much I changed, people would only remember my mistakes. But you've helped me believe that growth deserves to be seen too. Their voice trembled, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. Stay until the very end, because the biggest surprise had not yet arrived. As darkness gently covered the shoreline, thousands of tiny lanterns were released into the evening sky during a local community celebration. One after another, they floated upward until the night seemed filled with stars both above and below. Watching the glowing lights rise together, you quietly whispered, "Every lantern carries someone's hope." They smiled warmly before replying, "Maybe hope isn't about knowing exactly what happens next. Maybe it's about choosing to keep believing that tomorrow can become more beautiful than yesterday." The wind gently carried the lanterns higher into the night as both of you stood together in peaceful silence. Neither of you needed dramatic promises anymore. You had already discovered something much stronger. Trust had replaced uncertainty. Honesty had replaced fear. Patience had replaced pressure. Whatever the future held, you would meet it not as two strangers hiding behind perfect images, but as two imperfect hearts choosing each other with open eyes and open souls. As the waves continued their endless rhythm beneath the moonlight, they reached into their pocket and smiled. There was one final truth they had been waiting to share, not because it came from fear, but because it came from complete certainty. Taking a slow breath, they turned toward you and quietly said, "There's one more thing I've wanted to tell you, and after everything we've been through, I think tonight is finally the right time." The gentle breeze carried those words into the night, leaving both hearts standing on the edge of a moment that promised to change everything once again. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because the words they were about to speak had lived quietly inside their heart for longer than you could possibly imagine. The ocean breeze gently moved through the air as thousands of glowing lanterns drifted higher into the night sky. The celebration around you slowly faded into the background until it felt as though the entire world had become silent. They looked toward the horizon for a brief moment, taking one slow breath after another, gathering the courage they had searched for through countless sleepless nights. Every heartbeat reminded them that this was no longer a moment they could postpone. Some truths become too important to remain hidden. They turned toward you with eyes filled not only with hope but with complete honesty. "When I called you that night," they said softly, "I told you something big had happened. I thought the biggest change was realizing I couldn't hide my feelings anymore. But I was wrong. They paused, allowing the sound of the waves to fill the silence between you. The biggest change wasn't discovering how much I cared about you. The biggest change was discovering how much you've changed me. Those words carried a quiet sincerity that no dramatic speech could ever replace. For the first time, they weren't speaking from fear of losing you. They were speaking from gratitude for finding someone who had inspired them to become the person they always hoped they could be. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. They smiled through tears that reflected the glow of the lanterns above. Before you came into my life, I measured my worth by my failures. Every mistake became my identity. Every disappointment convinced me that I wasn't meant for lasting happiness. I kept waiting for life to prove that my past would always define me. Then you came along, not to rescue me, not to erase my history, but to remind me that people are capable of growing beyond the chapters that once broke them. Their voice trembled slightly. You never asked me to become perfect. You simply encouraged me to become honest. That changed everything. For several long moments, neither of you spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding that words alone could never fully express. You realized that the person standing before you was completely different from the one who had first nervously called you weeks earlier. The uncertainty that once clouded every sentence had disappeared. In its place stood someone who had finally learned that vulnerability is not weakness. It is one of the greatest forms of courage a person can choose. Something huge was waiting in this story. The following morning, before sunrise, both of you walked along the quiet shoreline. The beach was almost empty except for a few early fishermen preparing their boats. The horizon slowly transformed from deep blue to brilliant shades of gold and orange. Standing there together, you watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the water. They quietly whispered, "Every sunrise feels different now." You smiled gently and asked, "Why?" Without hesitation they answered, "Because I no longer wake up afraid of who I used to be. I wake up grateful for who I'm still becoming." Those simple words remained with you throughout the day. You realized that true transformation is rarely loud. It happens through countless quiet decisions repeated over time. It happens every time someone chooses truth instead of hiding, forgiveness instead of bitterness, humility instead of pride, and hope instead of fear. Looking at them, you could see those choices reflected in every action, every conversation, and every expression on their face. Stay until the very end, because another unexpected chapter was quietly unfolding. Later that afternoon, while exploring the small coastal town, you wandered into an old bookstore tucked away between two narrow streets. The owner warmly welcomed you before pointing toward a shelf filled with antique journals. One weathered book immediately caught your attention. Opening it carefully, you discovered a handwritten quote inside the first page: "Love does not ask whether yesterday was perfect. It asks whether today is honest enough to build tomorrow." Both of you looked at each other in complete silence. It felt as though those words had somehow found you exactly when you needed them most. As evening returned once again, you sat together on a quiet cliff overlooking the endless sea. There was no need for extravagant promises or dramatic declarations. Instead, you spoke about ordinary dreams. A peaceful home filled with laughter. Shared adventures to places neither of you had seen before. Quiet evenings reading together. Supporting one another through every unexpected challenge life might bring. You realized that the future no longer felt frightening because it was no longer something either of you would have to face alone. The stars slowly filled the sky as the waves continued their endless rhythm below. They reached for your hand, not out of fear that you might disappear, but out of gratitude that you had stayed. Smiling warmly, they whispered, "I used to believe love meant finding someone who would never see my flaws. Now I know real love begins the moment someone sees every flaw, every scar, every imperfect chapter, and still chooses to keep walking beside you." The night grew quieter as both of you remained there beneath the countless stars. Neither realized that another unexpected surprise was already waiting just beyond tomorrow's sunrise, a surprise that wouldn't test your love, but would reveal just how deeply your lives had become connected in ways neither of you had ever imagined. And as the ocean breeze gently carried away the last echoes of the evening, both of you stepped forward together, ready for the next chapter of a story that had only just begun. The call that changed everything. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because every conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every quiet tear, and every brave confession in this fictional story has been leading to this unforgettable sunrise. There are moments in life that divide our story into two parts: the life we lived before we found the courage to be completely honest, and the life that begins the moment fear no longer controls our hearts. This was that moment. As dawn slowly painted the sky with brilliant shades of gold and soft blue, both of you stood together overlooking the endless ocean. The waves rolled gently onto the shore, carrying away the footprints left behind during the long night. It felt like a quiet reminder that yesterday had done its work, and today was inviting both of you to begin again. Neither of you rushed to speak. There was no need. Every difficult conversation that had once seemed impossible had already happened. Every hidden feeling had finally found its voice. The silence between you no longer carried uncertainty, it carried peace. Looking at each other, you both realized how much had changed since that unexpected phone call. What had started as fear had slowly become trust. What had begun with hesitation had grown into confidence. And what had once seemed like the end of a story had quietly become its true beginning. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. They reached into their jacket pocket and removed the small folded letter they had carried for months. The edges of the paper had become worn from being opened and closed countless times, yet they had never found the courage to share it. Smiling gently, they handed it to you. "I wrote this long before I ever called you," they admitted. "Every time I wanted to give it to you, fear convinced me to wait." You unfolded the letter carefully. The first line spoke about admiration, gratitude, and quiet hope. As you continued reading, the words became more vulnerable. They wrote about the nights they questioned their own worth, the days they nearly walked away because they believed you deserved someone better, and the moment they realized that hiding the truth would only create more distance. The final sentence simply read, "If I ever become brave enough to tell you all of this, I hope it's because I've finally learned that real love begins with honesty." Tears quietly filled your eyes. You folded the letter with care and looked at them with a smile that carried more reassurance than any speech ever could. You didn't become brave because you stopped being afraid, you said softly. You became brave because you chose the truth even while you were afraid. Those words settled gently into the morning air. In that instant, they understood something they had spent years searching for. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing love, integrity, and honesty despite fear. Something beautiful was waiting until the very last page. Months passed, and together you built a relationship that wasn't perfect, but it was real. You celebrated joyful milestones, supported one another through unexpected challenges, laughed over simple moments, and never allowed difficult conversations to remain unspoken. When misunderstandings appeared, you chose patience over pride. When life became uncertain, you chose encouragement over blame. Little by little, your relationship became a place where both hearts could grow instead of pretending to have already arrived. One peaceful autumn afternoon, you returned to the quiet botanical garden where another chapter of your story had unfolded. The flowers were blooming once again, brighter than ever before. Walking along the same winding paths, you couldn't help smiling at how different everything felt. The garden hadn't changed. You had. Every fear that once followed you through those pathways had been replaced by quiet confidence. Every hidden emotion had become an open conversation. Every painful memory had become part of a journey that shaped two people into wiser, kinder, and more compassionate versions of themselves. Stay until the very end, because the greatest lesson had not yet been spoken. Before leaving the garden, you found the same wooden bench where so many important conversations had taken place. Sitting together beneath the shade of the old trees, you opened a brand new journal. On the very first page, together you wrote, "Love is not built in one extraordinary moment. It is built through thousands of ordinary choices. It grows every time honesty replaces fear, every time forgiveness overcomes resentment, every time kindness becomes stronger than pride, and every time two imperfect people choose to keep walking forward together. Our greatest miracle was never finding perfection. It was finding the courage to be completely ourselves." Closing the journal, you both smiled. There was no need to erase the past because it no longer controlled the future. The difficult chapters had become lessons instead of prisons. The fears that once kept you apart had become reminders of how far you had come. Looking toward the horizon, you realized that the unexpected phone call, the one that seemed so frightening at the beginning, had become the greatest turning point of your lives. It wasn't important because of the words that were spoken. It was important because it opened the door to a relationship built on truth instead of assumptions. As evening slowly settled across the sky, you walked home hand in hand, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature and the gent.